the grid markers might be slightly off, like so. And you can see where these white lines aren't necessarily lining up perfectly with the kick drum on this particular beat. So down here in the BPM editor, I have a set of arrows below the BPM section where I can actually what's the word I'm looking for? Compact the BPM, or actually expand it, the grid I'm talking about. So now I'm going to tap on these arrows here, and you can see the entire grid moving over, and I'm going to go ahead and tap on the grid until it lines up perfectly with that beat. Now I got it right on spot, and you'll notice that automatically in the BPM section now it says 127, and it switched from, I believe it was 71% to now 100%, because now it's perfectly on beat. The reason to do this in Traktor, for multiple reasons, is if you're doing auto syncing between multiple decks. For instance, if you're doing a 4-deck set or something like that, what you can do is hit the sync button so it matches BPMs with all the other tracks inside the system, and like maybe take small loops or segments of individual tracks and do kind of your own mashups and mixes. For instance, I'm going to go ahead and drop this track into the mix now and let that one play out. And I'm going to go ahead and select a different track that maybe might not have beat grid set up on it. For instance, this Pascal Fios remix, I'm going to load to the deck B now. Just like I did on deck A, I'm going to snap to the first beat. And you'll notice that up in the cue editing section, the color changes. And the reason why is because it's on deck focus mode. Basically, if I go back to A, you'll see that it turns blue, meaning that anything I change in the cue editor, the BPM section, is going to affect deck A. And if I go back to deck B, it's going to turn yellow again. So here's the first beat in the track. And I'm going to go once again to this drop-down menu and select the grid point. Drop the grid marker in there. And I'll scan through the track to make sure that the grid markers are actually lining up with the beat perfectly. So far it all seems to be really, really well, except here at the end I can tell that the grid marker's a little bit in front of the beat. So I'm going to use the arrows in the BPM editor to tap it back a few so it lines up perfectly. Now that I have it lined up perfectly, if I go back to the beginning of this track and cue it up, I can go ahead and hit the play button in sync, and you'll notice that I can bring the track into the mix. And we're right there, back on point. So now that I got both tracks in the mix, if you pay attention to these phase meter sections, sometimes audibly with my own ear, I can tell that maybe the BPM is just slightly off. For instance, if I move these phase meters right back in the middle, it might be slightly off. So what I'm using is these two nudge buttons here, and with these two nudge buttons I can actually nudge the track back and forth, very similar to how you would use on a turntable, so that they would match up perfectly. And now that I got them matched up absolutely perfectly, I might want to line up the grid itself with the track more consistently. Now, unlike these two arrows here, which expands and contracts the grid, these two arrows up on the top moves the entire grid in a whole completely from left to right. So I want to go ahead and move the entire grid a little bit to the right, and I want you guys to pay attention to how the phase meter here changes a little bit. Now if I tap on this, you'll see that the phase meter is moving back online. Now I got those tracks completely in sync perfectly. The good thing about this is that you only have to do it once, and once you do it in the track, it's going to save it for the rest of the remaining time that you have Traktor on your computer. Now if I go ahead and drop a loop, then I have two particular tracks synced up perfectly. That way I can go back and maybe open up the 4 decks, which we might show a little bit later in the segment, to show you how I can sync up 4 different tracks. Now another feature that's extremely useful that we might want to cover is cue points, which you'll also be using the cue editor for as well. I'm going to pull out deck A from the mix a little bit and go back to deck B. Now in deck B, I might need to set a cue point in the beginning of the track, here in the beginning on the first beat, and I can do that by going back up to the cue editor, dropping down the menu, and inserting a cue point. Now when I drop the cue point, you'll notice that the cue point is actually a blue marker, unlike the grid marker, which was white. And once I dropped the cue point in, you can see that it says lock, and up here in this field I can actually name that cue point to be whatever I want. Now for instance, I'm going to name this cue point start, which is the beginning of that track. And I'm going to go ahead and drop another cue point maybe here at this point, which is a little bit after the breakdown, and I'm going to drop another cue point and name that one breakdown. And I can go ahead and insert as many cue points throughout the track as much as I want. And if I go ahead and back up to the detail section and insert a cue list, then you can see the list of different cue points that I've added to every particular track. For instance, there's this cue point which I named start, which will jump the entire track back to the start point, or if I click the break button, it'll go ahead and jump back to the break where I insert the second cue point. Now, there's a lot of really cool things you can do that, and we're going to get a little bit more into the future about MIDI assigning, and you can go ahead and either assign a cue point to a MIDI controller or to a key on your keyboard. This is really helpful because there's a lot of really innovative DJs that can go ahead and insert a cue point on maybe a kick drum, and then maybe insert another cue point on a snare drum, and then go ahead and assign those cue points to maybe a pad on a trigger finger of some sort, and go ahead and use it kind of like a drum machine where you have one pad that triggers a drum kick and the other one that triggers the snare drum. So that concludes the end of our grid and cue point tutorial. Stay tuned and we'll go ahead and move on to the next segments of the tutorial video.